大家好我先来个自我介绍我姓梁，叫佳音非常荣幸和感谢社会领域教育研究中心小学组给我这个机会，可以和大家一起讨论我们都非常关注的国民教育。嗯，我非常感谢大家能够抽出宝贵的时间来参加我们今天的研讨会。在今天的研讨会上，我会利用澳洲的教育背景作为这次的讨论焦点。我很欢迎，也非常鼓励大家与我分享你们对于我提出的讨论焦点的意见和看法。任何时候，如果大家有任何你要 share，请都可以利用这个 chat 来分享你的看法，或者将自己取消静音，so just unmute yourself. Feel free to unmute yourself. 我希望采纳一个基于讨论的方式来跟大家商量，就是商讨教育的复杂性和张力，请大家多多指教。我来自新加坡，从2050年在澳洲悉尼生活。新加坡是一个双语教育制度，所以我很习惯用华语作为日常的沟通，但是在比较正规的场合上，例如这样的场合上，我还是比较习惯用英语。所以在今天的讨论会上，我会用英语来呈现给大家。So I'll start by, introducing myself in English. So I'm Jia Ying, and I'm a lecturer at the School of Education and Social Work at the University of Sydney. And today's presentation will be on the practice of civics and citizenship education in New South Wales, Australia. New South Wales is a really interesting state, Australian state, I will share a little bit more later on, because we are the only state that is resisting the federal curriculum that is implemented in all the other states and territories. All right. I'll start with the agenda of my presentation. I will first start with self-introduction, sharing with all of you who am I and how my positionality shapes my thinking about education. I then move on to a reflection on this key question of what is the purpose of education? And as I will share later, I think this question is full of complexities and tensions. And then I will use Australian education as a context to examine the practices of social studies and citizenship education. In particular, I will focus on two key questions. The first one is, how is citizenship education conceptualized in Australia? And what is or where is civics and citizenship education or citizenship education in the K to 6 curriculum? As I've shared just now, I hope to use this as an opportunity for us to engage in a discussion where we could come together and think about how we can come together as a group of like-minded people who are interested in the area of social studies and citizenship education, to think about what citizenship education is about. Please feel free to discuss with me any of your thoughts, question what I say, and feel free to challenge what I say as well. And lastly, hopefully by the end of this presentation, we could sort of come together and collectively to think about what is the next step for us educators working in this space of citizenship education. And I think this question is going to be particularly important, especially with globalization, where we see that the boundaries of nation states and societies become less and less obvious. All right, I'll start with a bit of with a self-introduction. So I'm Jia Ying, and I started off as a primary school teacher and then later on as a subject head for social studies in Singapore schools. So during that time, a large part of my work is school-based, where I work with colleagues and I teach primary school students. When I moved to Australia, I started to dip into a bit of research, but I was also a primary school teacher in New South Wales, Australia. So at that point in time, I then start to, balance my work a little bit between research and practice. And right now, I'm working at the University of Sydney as a lecturer, and I see a large part of my work in the area of initial teacher education. So here at the University of Sydney, we call our students to be pre-service teachers. So a large part of my work is really about preparing the pre-service teachers to be able to come out to schools to teach. Um, yeah, and because of my positionality and my experiences working across different countries, across different societies, this has made me to be very, very sensitive to this key question about what is the relationship between school and society. And as I see across contexts, sometimes there is a deliberate effort in terms of policy or government policy to try to make the connection between school and society really, really close. At other times, we also see very deliberate efforts from the government to try to bring or try to separate the relationship between school and the society. So, depending on what is the purpose of education and what is the social, political, and economic influences, that relationship between the school and the society differs. As I shared with you, as my part of my work as a lecturer at the University of Sydney, I teach this unit on pedagogy. And when I try to explain what pedagogy is with my students or with my pre-service teachers, I try to draw the connection between the idea between context, students, and teacher. Okay. And one question that year after year I've been asked is that, Ying, is there bias in my lectures or in the content that I teach? Whenever I'm asked this question, I like to be very, very upfront with my students. So I always tell them my lecture or the content that I teach has definitely been shaped by my own philosophy and views on education. It's dependent on my values and my experiences. And I also draw their attention that as part of the ethical practice of being a teacher, we need to be then as informed or as evidence informed as possible. So I then give them a framework where when making a decision in the classroom, they have to think about drawing on evidence from research, evidence from teaching practice, and evidence from students. And by doing so, I really want to bring their attention to the idea that education, whichever subject that they are teaching, is context based. Depends on what's happening right in front of them. I guess now just before I move to my next slide, if you can you just scan the code over here, or you can just go to menti.com, yeah, and key in the code. I'd like to hear what all of you think the purpose of education is. So let's take 1 or 2 minutes here and let's think about or let's concentrate on this question. We're all educators. What do we think the purpose of education is? Um, it's anonymous, so feel free to type in anything. We will not know who wrote what, but just to get a general feeling of what we all think the purpose of education is. To become qualified citizenship, whoever you are, maybe can you just help me to expand a little bit more? What is the distinction between qualified citizenship, or is there such a thing as not so qualified citizenship? Feel free to type it in the chat as well. To be a better man, I'm not sure whether it is showing. Oh, yeah, it's showing now. That's great. Yeah. Living in a society, self actualization, interpersonal communication, helping students. 各方面的能力, okay, so a holistic development, social adaptation. Perhaps if I'm getting it, it will be something like what they need to know. Okay, make students understand social adaptation, learn self-actualization, interpersonal communication. Okay, all right. Just keep it coming. We will come back to we'll come back to this in a while. Interesting. Develop good moral character. Yeah. Okay. Now just let it sit with you for a while. And then I'm going to show you in my next slide what my pre-service teachers say. And I'd like you to think about what connections can you see between what they say and what we have said here. Okay. So I've collected data over the years from 2021, 2022, and 2023. I'll give you some time here to look at some of their responses. What is the similarity that you see between what you have said, what we have shared, and what the pre-service teachers here are saying? Perhaps I'll start with my first question. What are we observing about what they're saying? What do we observe? Type it in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself. What do we observe? Maybe I'll start by sharing a few observations. I do find that in 2022, it's quite interesting. The largest word there is knowledge, whereas in 2023 and 2021, words like growth and development comes up more. We do see knowledge as quite a common word coming up in 2023 as well. But in 2023, it's quite interesting because this is the only year that I'm seeing that this idea of critical thinking becoming really prominent. Whereas I don't think I see it very much in 2022. In 2023, some. Okay, so observing a few differences and similarities here and there. And then, just, take a few moments to think, in the one that we talked about earlier, to what extent do we see similarities and differences? Yeah, and we've got one new interesting one to make everyone more rich. Yeah, so an economic purpose there. Well, we've sort of highlighted a few points here and there. So how do we interpret these responses? Okay, it will be something for us to think about because society is so diverse. If there's so many different purposes, how do we interpret these responses? What may be some of the implications for education policy and initial teacher education? Where or what are we heading towards? And perhaps, keep at the back of our mind, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end of this presentation to then start thinking about how does it compare with the context that you are all working in. All right, now let's move on to the next part where now I got really curious because my students were telling me so many different things about the purpose of education. So I started getting curious and I reviewed the literature. So broadly what is literature saying about the purpose of education? Now, I think generally across what I've read in literature, there are two key recognitions. The first one is that there is greater interconnectedness among people, societies, and nations. Just look at us, we're actually interacting and engaging with one another across time and space right now, right? So this illuminates or highlights or reinforces this idea of global citizenship. Right? However, there is also a recognition that in on one hand, we are recognizing the need to recognize greater diversity, but it is in competition with the rise of neoliberalism, where there is this strong focus on results, competition, and then inevitably it then narrow the public sphere, because when we are talking a lot about competition, we're putting a lot of responsibility on self. How do you take care of yourself? How do you not rely on the government? How do you not engage with, for example, political discussions? So inevitably it starts to narrow the sphere of the public sphere. um Oops, let me see. Yeah, I guess with these two conflicting recognition, the implication for education is that education is becoming more and more complex, and it is reflecting political priorities, economic priorities, and social priorities. And within each of these priority, they are inherently contested. Perhaps a question here is really to ask, what is a good balance, or how do we achieve a good balance between these priorities? Um, I then drew on Biasta's work, and who talk about the three dimensions of the purposes of education. I felt that having a framework to help me to then interpret, my students' conceptions of the purpose of education was helpful. Biasa is not the only one. If we look at, if we review literature, we really often see that scholars, across different countries and nations, they tend to want to provide a framework. And very often they are talking about these three dimensions without drawing actually strong or explicit connections with one another. So here I drew on the work of Biasta and Westheimer to give us a frame to reflect on what are the different purposes of education. So the first one here is what Westheimer called as a personally responsible citizen. And Biasta extends that by saying that this purpose is very focused on the provision of knowledge, skills, and understanding for our students or for people to do something. So it can range from very specific ones, such as a job, like when you have to teach this what you do, or more general ones like the culture, like how do you vote, or who do you call when you're in danger or when someone is in danger. So this qualification purpose is very utilitarian. Not that it's not good, it's just utilitarian. It's very focused on what people have to do. Then participatory citizen, as with the name participatory, becomes more participatory. So it is about thinking about how we can help our students to become members and part of particular social, cultural, and political orders. So, for example, what is expected in the Taiwanese society may be a bit different from what they're required or to function in an Australian society. So, socialization into the existing world. The third one is what Biasta calls subjectification purpose, also strongly related to this idea of justice-oriented citizens. For the subjectification purpose, it's really turning that spotlight onto that person itself, thinking about who am I and why are things happening around me the way it is. It is very related to ideas of critical thinking, analysis, dynamism, and transformation. So at this point, I just pause here. Which one you can type it in the chat, or just write it in your notes, and then we can discuss later. At this point, which of these purposes do you think makes people the most uncomfortable? Okay. When I explain this to my students, I give them an image. A personally responsible citizen, when they see homeless people on the streets, they will start thinking, how can I help them? And they start bringing in cans of food to these homeless people to help them. So that's being personally responsible. The second one is when they see homeless people on the streets, they start to think, let's have a food drive. Then they start to bring in groups of people who will then bring in food and then collectively giving them to the homeless people, for example. A social justice oriented citizen would start thinking, why is it that our society has got homeless people? I think, especially in the context of Australia, we could encourage students to start thinking that Australia is quite a rich country, but why is it that if you go to Sydney, the streets of Sydney, you see so many people who are homeless and living on the streets? So the subjectification purpose as related to justice-oriented citizen is the one that is recognized as widely desirable, but also recognized as very challenging, unsettling, and uncomfortable. So when I work in initial teacher education, this is actually one of the challenges that my colleagues and I are facing right now. When we try to get the pre-service teachers to start thinking about why education is the way it is, why is education so contested, and why is education a dilemma, many of our pre-service teachers, I'm not saying all, but many of our pre-service teachers, start feeling a bit uncomfortable and sometimes even angry and asking the question, why do I have to think about the questions like this? I'm just going into the classroom to teach, right? So I think it really illuminates this idea that it is desirable, but it's also challenging, unsettling, and uncomfortable. And this idea of personally responsible citizen is the one that inevitably or unintentionally support this market imperative in education, because we are focusing on what can you do. So what is your contribution? Okay. I think what Biasta and what Westheimer is saying here is that it's not that one is better than the other. Sometimes in education, they all coexist. But the question here is, what is the priority? Okay. Just going back to that slide again. Hopefully, with that framework of the three purposes, the three dimensions of the purposes of education, we could start to then interpret some of the things that we're saying. So when I see the word or the phrase critical thinking, I'm actually quite happy that in 2023, my pre-service teachers are starting to think about the possibility of subjectification. Okay, I personally find the 2002 data where they talk about socialization and knowledge more, more associated with qualification and socialization. And we'll come back to review this later if we have time. My next step here is really we've looked about purposes, which is that goal, but John Dewey say that it is not enough because when we are thinking about the growth, the goals, the agenda, we also really need to think about then what are the educational experiences that we can provide to support the growth, because not all experiences are educative. And he made it a point to say that there needs to be very strong connections between the two. And Biasta says the same thing too, in that, if we place too much focus on talking about where do we want to go, what do we want to do, and things like that, it then put the discussion or any discussions about education in a very instrumental terms. And it can then bring that discussion very quickly back to technical questions about effectiveness and efficiency. So then shifting that purpose to a priority of a qualification purpose. Okay. So I guess the main thing about this slide here is let's bear in mind when we talk about education, let's not just talk about the goals, but also think about what experience we will give. Yeah. And also, when we keep talking about the goals, it then make it for us as educators to resist when we are being asked to do things that will then go against our integrity. But when we then bring in the idea of experience, then we can start seeing, how do they match with each other. Okay. Now, I'll share 5 key ideas of active and informed citizenship that I've identified reviewing literature in the last 20 years. Okay. I guess the first one is when we think about citizenship, especially the idea of active and informed citizenship, they are really talking or placing a lot of focus that citizenship is a very social endeavor. And that when we are talking about goals, we're not just talking about individual goals, but also collectively, where do we want to head? Active and informed citizenship is a very dynamic concept where it is open to contestation, change, and social reconstruction. And this really addressed this idea of the idea of politics, nothing to do with political party, but the very idea of diversity, where every one of us have got very different needs and wants, but very limited resources. So how do we negotiate that balance? The third one emphasizes participation. The fourth one talks about social justice and democracy. And this is very, very, very contested. So for me, I've come from Singapore and now living in Australia. Both countries have got very different definition or conception of what democracy mean and what social justice mean. Okay, even though both countries uses or they use these two terms very very everywhere in policies. They also talk about the application of competencies in multiple geographical spheres. I think this is the one that is very closely related to global citizenship. So here, what purpose does education seek to serve? I'm going to share with you what I think the purpose of cities, the purpose that education seek to serve if we take into these 5 key ideas. But this is where I'd like you to feel free to disagree with me. Now, for me, when I think about diversity, dynamism, social justice, democracy, and global citizenship, I tend to see or think that it is more related to the idea of subjectification, this idea of critical thinking, analysis, being able to think why are things the way it is. You can disagree because I really think that it can be open to multiple interpretations. So the way we think what purpose education seek will then impact our pedagogy and then in turn our teaching strategies. So that experience that we provide. Okay, I now turn the attention to Australia. What's happening in Australia? Okay? A very quick run through of the timeline. Just very quickly, Australia went through a major educational reform in 2008. When I say major, it is quite major because it is the first time in Australian educational history that Australia has a national curriculum. So in the past, every state and territory were doing their own things, teaching different things. There could be some similarities and differences, but then in 2008, all the governments in the state and territories came together and they agreed that yes, we need to have a national curriculum. So 2008, with the Melbourne Declaration, goal number 2 was very, very explicit about wanting to develop young Australians to become active and informed citizens. And you wonder what that means, right? There was discussion paper that was distributed, very, very extensive process, and feedback was received. At the end of 2013, so was a bit slow, so that's a few years down the road, then they finally finalize the curriculum, okay? But we also need to take in mind that before they start to finalize this Australian curriculum, civics and citizenship education curriculum, other syllabuses or other curriculum has already been released and implemented in school. So if we look at the timing, we start to think, so 2012 history, 2015 geography, then where is civics and citizenship? Okay. This year, in fact, right now, it just closed on Monday. Between July and September, then suggest to have a new syllabus. Okay, I'll share with you what the new syllabus look like in a while. So we talk about the national curriculum, and I talked about a little bit earlier at the beginning when I started. New South Wales is a very, very unique case because it is the only state that is resisting a national curriculum. And of course, for various political reasons, just off there has been talks that maybe because New South Wales government is a bit conservative, so you can see that at the national level, humanities and social sciences, which is social science essentially, has got 4 key areas: history, geography, economics, civics, and citizenship education. Okay? Now I'm going to show you in the New South Wales curriculum, we only have history and geography. We don't have economics and business, and we don't have civics and citizenship education. So the curricular context of New South Wales primary school is really this. Okay, at the national level, we're meant to teach 4 different dimensions of humanities and social sciences, but in New South Wales, we essentially only have history and geography. Okay, and up to now, I can tell you NESA, which is the curriculum body in New South Wales, has not, and I don't think they have plans to implement civics and citizenship education anytime soon. So, in a situation like this, we start to think, where is civics and citizenship education? How is civics and citizenship education addressed through history and geography? There is very, very little curricular guidance on how teachers can do this in schools. There is a very vague conception of civics and citizenship education. They just say active and informed citizens, but what does active and informed citizens mean? So for interest, this term active and informed citizen is also a term used in Singapore. So both countries uses the exact same term, but they actually mean very, very different things. Okay? I'll give you an example of the history geography content in New South Wales. I'll just pause here and give you some time to have a quick read. And perhaps as you read, think about to what extent do you think the content here is related to citizenship education. So feel free to type it in the chat. To what extent do you think, yeah, it is citizenship education, or not quite, or no, it's not citizenship education? take a few moments here. Feel free to put it in a message chat because that's going to help me. Okay. A bit of wait time here, but start thinking about this because this is exactly what the New South Wales government is saying. The New South Wales government view is that all this is citizenship education. And to some extent, it is true because, when we are learning about, say, for example, the cause and effect on Australian society, when we are looking at diverse features and characteristics of people and environment, how do cultures or people or places differ across the world, there is potential. Okay, there is potential for citizenship education. Um, the main question really is what sort of civics and citizenship education? What purpose does it seek to serve? Okay, so let's keep that at the back of our mind and feel free to ask any questions later on. So again, my key question is looking at a syllabus outcome like this, is there more of a prioritization of qualification, socialization, or subjectification? Or is it open to interpretation? So it is in this very, very complex situation where civics and citizenship education is not clear and not explicit that I got really curious about two key questions. What is active and informed citizenship? What does it mean to the schools in Australia, the educators in Australia? And what are the school experiences that support learning for active and informed citizenship? So, with these two goals in mind, I went into 4 different schools in New South Wales. Okay. The first school is a private Anglican school using an IB program. So, very, very elite. The principal and the teachers in the school recognizes that the students in this school, number one, come from very privileged background. When I visited the school, you see that some students are driving into the school with very, very expensive cars. So it is a very elite school. Okay. And one interesting thing that the teachers continually bring up is that our students are very privileged. They've traveled the world, so they are global citizens. Okay. School number 2 is a public school in New South Wales, but situated in a very high SES area. So this means that even though it's a public school, the students come from families with so-called higher than average family income. Okay? School number 3 is a public school in a low SES area. In fact, it is a school that has a very large proportion of students with refugee backgrounds. So the school constantly think about how they can help the students to be part of Australia. Okay? And this school also make efforts to make sure that they do not do renovation works during the day because even words, sounds like knocking scares the students. The last school is a private Catholic school. The SES is quite interesting. It's in the middle. Although it's a private school, it has a very strong religious background. It's a Catholic school. Okay? So I went into each of the 4 schools. I did an interview each with principals and 2 teachers. I observed the HSIE or the social studies lessons, and I reviewed their documents, their programs, and their websites. So what did I find? Okay, so what's happening with civics and citizenship education in New South Wales primary school? I guess the first key thing that got me is that schools, all of these 4 schools, have some ideas about what citizenship is about, but they do not have a concrete view of citizenship education. So, in fact, school number 1 and 2, the participants, the teachers were very, very explicit in telling me Ying, I know you're coming and you're going to ask me something about citizenship education. And that's why I went up to the website, to the internet, and start looking up what citizenship education is about. And then when I talk to them, they have some idea about what citizenship education is about, but they're not quite sure. Okay. Across the four schools, they all think that everything is relevant to citizenship education. I just want to pause here and just take one or two one just 1 minute here and think to what extent in our own practice we actually agree or disagree with this sentence that everything is relevant to civics and citizenship. To some extent, I agree. I do agree that everything is relevant to civics and citizenship education. And that is why the interpretation of everything that we do is so important. How do schools approach active and informed citizenship? So I go into schools and I tell them, have you heard of the term active and informed citizenship? How do you teach that? And all the schools, because they have so different contexts, they have unique approaches for active and informed citizenship. Sometimes it's shaped by their school philosophies, directions, and student profile. So, for example, school number 4 here, which is a private Catholic school, it is very much shaped by their religious philosophy. So they talk about active and informed citizenship as walking in the steps of Jesus, for example. When you go into the private Anglican school here, which uses the IB program, they then use this idea of the IB, the overarching goal for IB, as their guiding principle for thinking about what active and informed citizenship is. Okay? They do have some common approaches among the 4 schools, which I'll share in my next slide. Okay? So the first question is, do schools take on a social view of active and informed citizenship? Now, this idea that schools do take an integrated view. So it is not limited to scholarly or curricular conceptions of active and informed citizenship. So what I shared about the 5 key ideas, it doesn't mean that they talk about that. And what was interesting is they also, schools across these 4 schools, include personal and social views. So they do talk about civics and citizenship education, or the idea of active and informed citizenship as related to personal well-being, achieving, aspirations, life skills, and responding to emergencies. So we do get a bit of bushfires here. So they talk about, who do you call, what do you do when a bushfire occurs? Okay? So to them, that's civics and citizenship too. For you, that might be civics and citizenship too. And that's interesting because that then extend what scholarly discussion about what citizenship is about. So again, what is the prioritization? And I think that there is a very strong similarity among the 4 schools that when they talk about personal well-being and they talk about achievement, there seems to be a very strong focus on the qualification purpose. The second one is all schools recognize the social nature of democratic citizenship. So the idea that the world, the society, people are becoming more and more diverse, they all recognize that. Especially in Australia, they recognize that you often hear them say Australia is multicultural, so it will impact citizenship. Okay? Therefore, they often highlight these values of respect, tolerance. Let's celebrate diversity. Okay? And then I'll show you what celebration of diversity will mean for them. Okay? So as we can see, we see that these concepts are not explicitly related to concepts of democracy, but they do have some values and they are addressed not just through the formal curriculum, addressed through school rules, religious values, otherwise ad hoc, whenever the teacher feels that it is valuable. I'd like to share, on this, share a very interesting case with you. I told you this idea of multiculturalism is seemingly a very big thing in Australia. So, we know that Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia is a key cross curriculum priority. Okay, which just means that all teachers have to teach it within whatever subjects that they teach. Okay? So I like to share this example with you. So this happened in a K to 6 geography classroom. So it is in a year 5 classroom. Um, yeah, year 5 or year 6 classroom, 11 to 12-year-old children. So this teacher or this group of teachers were teaching about diversity of cultures in Asia. Okay? In this particular classroom, this teacher is focusing on India. Okay, I'll just stop here and just help and just highlight a few things. For them, learning about culture is appreciation of Asian cultures, location, geographical features, history, festival, food, how do they dress. Okay? And this is the specific one here, very wordy, but I'd like to draw your attention to this part here. I'll read it to you. Imagine you are a child from any Asian country. Your parents are desperate for a better life and have decided to flee for Australia by boat as refugees. The boat is very overcrowded and the journey is treacherous. Write a diary. Okay, just pause here and just have a thought. Okay, how can this be problematic? What sort of image is the teacher portraying about India or about Asia to the students here in Australia? My next question is, it is a multicultural country here in Australia. How would a student with Indian heritage feel about how the country is being taught in the classroom? So, yes, diversity, yes, multiculturalism, yes, respect, but this is how it is being interpreted and practiced in the classroom. Okay, so how can it be problematic? Now, I'll highlight a few things. So, this is just a picture of some of the students' work. When they say they learn about other countries, when they learn about multiculturalism, it's only about, what do the people in India celebrate? Things like that. Several issues with that. First one, they're always looking to diversity from a third person perspective. So they're trying to understand others through being disconnected from the situation or the context itself. The second is really problematic because someone else in Asia or in Australia is trying to explain someone else in Asia about them. So, this idea of identity, they're not even, constructing their own identity. But here we have so big a multiculturalism, but trying to explain who someone else is. The third one is that they sort of forgot that, within cultural groups, it is fluid and it's very ambiguous as well. Who are Indians? What are Indians like? Who are the Chinese? What are Japanese? Who are the Singaporeans? And I think the two key impacts will be it creates a distinction away from the actual encounter. So instead of encouraging students to then decide what they need to do when they encounter someone else, we're already trying to tell them this is the way Indians are, this is the way other people are. And this is what multiculturalism is. And it shifts the focus from all of us being here and now. And it creates the illusion or that thought that some cultural groups are more backwards. Because I was there observing the classes and I hear students saying, like, would it happen in Australia? No, it will not happen in Australia because we have laws to protect us. So it creates that kind of deficit view about someone else that is not them. Okay? So I'll move on to the next one. So with this integrated approach, an integrated view of civics and citizenship, where they think that everything is civics and citizenship, it doesn't mean that everything they teach is explicitly related to civics and citizenship education. And within social studies, it's very historical based, history of um, history of Australia. Okay, beyond social studies, it is whenever the teacher feels that it is about civics and citizenship, it is about civics and citizenship. And one thing here, which I want to bring up another key point here. Remember how we talk about the three different types of citizens? Okay, the canned food, the food drive, and the homeless people. Okay? To the teachers, the justice-oriented citizen, one that talks about justice, one that need to think critically, one that need to analyze, is better suited for academically high achieving students. Okay, so they say that, oh, because our students are, our students are academically high, they are performing very well academically, so I really want to use the opportunity for them to think critically, to analyze. Okay, and then we got school number one saying, oh, our students come from very privileged backgrounds, so they actively they actively encourage them to drive the things, to analyze things. Okay, do we think like that sometimes? Okay. What is problematic is the one that comes next here. Okay. Um, the personally responsible citizen is identified as more suitable to students who are, for example, new arrivals to Australia, because they view that when students are new arrivals to Australia, they need life skills such as the norms of the society. They need to learn English. They need to know Australian laws so that they can best, they can be the best that they can in the society, so that they will not be ostracized or excluded. So there is some form of distinction here where I think the that unintended or intended result will be, sorting the citizens. If you come from a privileged background, if you're doing well academically, you can be a justice oriented citizen in the society. So drive what you want, question everything. Okay. Whereas if you're new, you're not that, doing that well academically, you're new, you're surviving as a new citizen, as refugees, just learn the laws. Okay. Just do your best. And I even have one, sort of sentence there that I didn't put in. They talk about how they should not be, burdening the social system. Okay? So there is that sorting of citizens happening through the way that we teach about citizenship. Yeah. So, sometimes when I present this and I tell my students that this does happen, they often ask, like, how can this happen? Do teachers even do this? This is so problematic. But yes, we do sometimes unintentionally, really looking at what is in front of us, but not yet really reflecting on the larger purpose of education. Second one, I'm going to go a bit faster now, is active citizenship taught as a dynamic concept? The idea is, actually not really. In Australian schools, even though it takes a liberal political orientation, it's still very largely knowledge based. This is what happened in the past. This is what happened, and learn the dates. And this is what happened. Okay. They do talk a little bit about some controversial topics like, struggles and impact on Australia's democracy, especially our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community here. But they hardly relate to present perspective. All right. If anything to do with what's present, is mainly about the formal political institution. How do you vote? what are the three, the two levels of government. Okay, it's very, very knowledge based. Um, there is some emphasis on student centered strategies. You hear teachers talk a lot about this idea of inquiry. Okay? And what does inquiry mean to them? Okay? There are some exceptions here where they make use of simulation, they make use of role play, but that is for those students who are doing well academically. Okay, when I went into students in classes where teachers don't regard that they are doing well academically, generally it's a sit down, listen, and do type of approach. Okay? It's very interesting because I got really excited when the teachers start saying we're using inquiry based learning. We're teaching them how to think critically. And then when I went into the classroom, I realized what they mean by inquiry is they will ask students, what questions do you have? Okay, now you have a question. Go to the laptop or go to the computer and look up for information. And maybe the next step will be coming together, do a poster about what you found on the internet and put it across the class. So is that really inquiry? I don't quite think so. I think it's more about finding out rather than, inquiring and looking at the possibility of, what's happening there. So a lot of lost opportunity there. What is critical thinking to the teachers? It's about identifying and then describing different perspectives. Okay, the Indians do this. In Australia, we do this. So we identify, yes, we are similar, but we're different. Okay, but minimally about higher order thinking. Why are we different? What else do I want to know? Is what I'm getting, is this information reliable or not? What could be the other perspective about what's happening? There is very minimal attention to higher order thinking. In fact, in many of my classrooms, many of the questions that students ask, like, they raise their hand, why is it like this? Or, why are we so different? These questions are generally ignored by the teachers. Okay. There is this is quite interesting. They use the idea of mathematics as citizenship. So they say that, oh, when they do an inquiry in mathematics, that's citizenship education. It can be not. So that's where the complexity come in. Okay. Deliberation, contestation, not addressed, not quite addressed. Okay. Last three more is participation in the different spheres encouraged. Yeah, generally, Australian schools are very big on participation. Okay, but participation comes from a very altruistic and apolitical view. So, for example, oh, we have a lot of homeless people in the streets of Sydney. What do? Oh, we need to have a food drive. We need to bring a can of food tomorrow. Okay, so they do have multicultural events and celebrations in school. Each wear your cultural costumes. Okay, those students in leadership roles tend to be a bit more active, but they're really not really examining why things are happening. Okay? There's one school, which is the IB school, which is the one that is a very well-to-do school. Well, the principal did talk about the idea of having an open school culture where she encouraged any student to speak to her. But other than that, across the 4 schools, they're pretty similar. Just, okay, bring a coin, bring a gold coin, bring a can of food, will help this. But they're really not asking why. Last one, oh, not last one. And the next one here is, they do talk about historical understanding. In Australia right now, there is a very big discussion about, Aboriginal rights. And, we're going to have a referendum at the end of the year, thinking about whether we need to change the constitution to have a greater Aboriginal voice in Parliament. Okay, they do talk about that in the society that this is happening, but not necessarily giving students the opportunity to really discuss and deliberate on it. Okay, like I said, presence perspective largely about how do you vote, how do you fill out a voting slip, or things like that. Okay, And we're not very surprised. Remember, I say, why is it that New South Wales is the only one? Well, Scott Morrison lives in New South Wales. He's no longer our prime minister. But in 2018, when the students started to get a bit more active in supporting the climate change, he told everyone and all the schools, no, you should be in the class rather than protesting. So because things like this doesn't belong to the school and what you need to do. So it goes back to what I said earlier, that in some cases, even though the relationship between school and society needs to be close, there are sometimes for political reasons they really want it to be separate. Okay? Is it rooted in concepts and values of social justice and democracy? I told you in Singapore, these words or these terms are used very widely as well. So is in Australia. Okay. So in school number one, remember, because they use the IB program, there is very explicit use of the term social justice. But this is not a very common term used in the other class. Okay. But then again, what do they mean by social justice? It's really about charity and assistance. Okay. It's not so much about questioning why the things are as they are. Okay? On democracy, this idea of voting. Okay, just because it's voting, it is a democracy. So there tend to be a very linear connection there. They do talk about democratic values sometimes, like this is not fair or that's fair, but it's never explicit linked with how the society regards themselves as a democracy. Some, but not all the concepts are addressed. Okay, they talk about democracy. Anyone in Australia, they will tell you it's a democracy, blah, 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 but it means different things to different people. 5, are the competencies applied in multiple geographical spheres? The idea is yes. I think in, at least across the 4 schools, they tell you that we need to be global. We need to look out. We need to know what's happening outside of Australia. They talk about current affairs. They talk about cultural diversity, but think about the way that they did it, as with the example that I showed earlier about India. It's still looking outwards and trying to explain what is out there, rather than thinking about how we can engage to know, how different people think. So I've shared quite a bit now. So, what does it mean for education for active and informed citizenship in New South Wales primary schools? So, now I draw the link back to my main slide. What's happening for citizenship education in Australia? What would you say to someone who has not attended this lecture? Oops. Okay, right. I'll share a few thoughts with you. The first one is, I think in the chat, Shivan, you were saying, yeah, I think in Australia, much as they see themselves as a liberal democracy, it is still currently, in terms of education, very focused on the participatory citizen. The idea that, okay, there is a problem, let's get together, let's have a food drive, let's do something together. They're not really thinking about why is this happening in the first place. Okay, so I do find, and in my daily life here, I do find people here are generally very participative. You have a problem, let's think what to do together. Okay, it is more aligned with Biasta's qualification and socialization purposes. Okay, doing something or being part of the society. But in the national curriculum for citizenship education, the aspiration for active and informed citizenship is really about justice oriented, where they pride themselves as a liberal democracy. We need to question, we need to debate, we need to change established system and structure, which is what the voice, the referendum that we're going to have at the end of the year is about. But this is not really taught in the schools. So currently, you know, there is a sorry, yeah. So currently, there is a gap between what schools are doing and what the curriculum, or at least the main policy, is aspiring to become. But this is where I really want to draw back to the idea of John Dewey's idea: goals and experiences need to come together, because goals, they can use the same language, they can say that they're doing that, but until we see what they're doing, we can't really tell whether there is an alignment or not. And from this Australian context, we can see that yes, words like democracy, words like active and informed citizenship is used really, really commonly, but if we really look at what experiences they're providing in the schools, there is actually a gap. So, is this a cause for concern, right? For me, as an educator working in initial teacher education and in social studies and in citizenship education, I think it's a cause for concern because there has been, reforms going on for more than 10 years already. And, there is a refocus on citizenship education in the last 30 years. So much effort has been put in to emphasize the importance of citizenship education in Australian education. But, the situation remains the same as before 30 years ago. So we have not really made a lot of progress. In fact, if we look at a lot of what I've presented earlier, there is actually a shift towards that qualification purpose. And then, it then has that unintended impact of, supporting neoliberalism, that everyone is seeing education as like a market competition, you know. Yeah. And it's no wonder why, our younger generations here are very reluctant to really want to participate in the society. Okay, we are really now in a situation that there's a lot of debate going on about the voting to change the constitution. But you see, not many schools talk about it. Students don't really care. In fact, there is even this poster going around: if you don't know, vote no. All right. And there is another one that says, if you don't know, go and find out. So, that very easy. If you don't know, then just vote no. And that's democracy. But that's not really quite the liberal democracy that the curriculum aspire or say that it is. Yeah. And I wanted to share, we sort of got a bit excited here that there is a new curriculum here coming out. But if you look at the new curriculum that has been, that's just been released, we see that it's still the same. Nothing has changed. Yeah, I don't know why. And it's quite interesting. They ask for feedback, but they don't really ask for feedback from for teacher educators working at the university. Yeah, and when I went into the portal to try to give my feedback, it's not really much about what the curriculum is or how they can improve, but rather, you understand, how would you implement this in your classroom? So again, very socialization purpose, not really asking reviewers to think critically about the content as well. So what's next? My analysis of the situation, I provide some possible steps forward. I think the first step here is for the NASA, which is the national or the state curriculum body responsible for New South Wales education, to really negotiate the struggles that they are having between federal and state policies for citizenship. I'm even thinking, before they can negotiate, they need to recognize that there are struggles going on. I don't think they recognize that there are struggle. They're just doing whatever they want. Okay, there is a need for them to make more explicit the commitment to democratic values and to take a more dynamic view of active citizenship. So right now, it's still this is the way it is. This is what you do. Okay? For schools, we really need strong leadership. We need to then leverage on the strength of the school leadership to extend participation beyond altruistic goals. Okay. Here we have this. I'm not sure whether you've heard about this, but this term called the savior mentality, where they think, I'm from Australia, I'm going into countries to help those less privileged. So participation really need to go beyond that. I'm helping someone, okay? But to really help them to think critically about social issues and to help them see themselves as possible agents of change, to be able to identify what's going on in the world around us. For teachers, I think it's about finding that balance between the different purposes of education. Like I said, it's not one or the other, but really how do we balance that? Have a healthy balance between the different purposes. They need to move beyond just thinking of education or as transmitting knowledge to how do we help the students to see themselves as citizens and not citizens to be. Balancing the past and present, what's happened in the past, but also drawing connections to what's happening right now. How can we change? Having that balance between personal and social interests. And of course, for teacher educators like us working in the university, we need to recognize that, as we work with teachers, these teachers coming to us as pre-service teachers are relying on their past experiences in their previous schooling experiences. And so, we really are in a very, very challenging, but again, meaningful space where we do have that opportunity to think about how we can shift their thinking to a more healthy balance between the different purposes, particularly more focus on the subjectification purpose. It's not easy. We're faced with a lot of resistance, at least in the university that I'm working now, and in another research project that I'm working on right now, where I'm interviewing teacher educators and what they think. So far, across universities, in the data that we've collected, we've got teacher educators collectively recognizing that there is a tension. Like, I want to help my pre-service teachers to think critically, to question, and to think what, the implications for their practice. But because such work takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, firstly, institutionally, we don't have enough time. And then secondly, students don't want to do that because, so many of them are actually very uncomfortable being pushed out of their comfort zone. And I guess the challenges and opportunity, I think this should be my last slide. In Australia, we are really facing a very, very, sharp teacher shortage because, the world is changing, but they're still doing the same thing as they're doing 30 years ago. They're not coping with the new demands, and a lot of teachers here are actually quitting. Okay, and there is a lot of report coming out about how we can train our teachers to be resilient without actually recognizing that we need to change our thinking about the purpose of education. And until we recognize that we need to change collectively as an education fraternity, I think this is going to continue the process. This idea of dissatisfaction at work because the world is changing around us. But in education here in Australia, we're not quite, responding fast enough. Yeah. Oops. Yeah. So I guess, I think we're almost time. We could take a few questions and then before we break, or we could have a break now and come back for questions. Would be, how did the Australian context relate to the context that you worked in? What are the similarities that you see? And what are the differences? Yeah, like what you say, the white man burden mentality. And right now, there is a strong white man's guilt going on in Australia because of their past, history with the Aboriginal people in Australia. So this idea of white man's guilt is something that's very commonly talked about right now in Australia. What opportunity do we see in our work in social studies and humanities education? What challenges are there? And how can we, with this idea of global citizenship, strengthen collaboration across national boundaries? Because, at this point, we sort of can't run away from the fact that there are many shared issues that we are facing together collectively. So I guess I'll stop here with this slide. It's up to you. Should we take a break and come back at, well, yeah, with, I'll just pause here and let the organizer decide. Should we take a break now and leave this question here Q&A later? Then we can have a bit more time for Q&A.